The American icon is not roaring anymore. It is stalling on its own weight. For over a century, Harley-Davidson defined what freedom looked like on two wheels. But today, that legacy is under extreme pressure from every direction, and the cracks are impossible to ignore. In this video, we break down exactly how this brand engineered its own decline, and the 3 radical moves that could still pull it back from the edge. Because if you still think this is just a market shift, you are already missing the real story. This did not happen by accident, it was built over time. This is not a story about a company caught off guard. This is a story about Harley-Davidson watching the road change and refusing to turn. The market did not vanish. Riders still exist. Competitors are still growing. The uncomfortable truth is simple. Harley did not lose the market, it disconnected from it, and that changes everything. What you are about to see is not random failure. It is a pattern. Pricing pushed newcomers out. An aging customer base hid the damage. Heritage replaced innovation. Products drifted away from real-world use. Internally, short-term stability overruled long-term survival. Alone, survivable. Together, a closed loop. A system that sustains itself while quietly destroying its own future. Because once you see it, you cannot unsee it. If you have ever looked at a Harley and felt that pull, but also questioned whether it still makes sense today, hit that like button, drop a hype in the comments, and subscribe. That is what keeps us committed to breaking down, not just the dream, but the reality riders are actually facing right now. This is not one mistake, it is a sequence. But every sequence has a starting point. And here it begins with the most damaging decision of all, cutting off the next generation before it ever got in. So before pricing or product, we start with who Harley failed to bring in. For decades, Harley-Davidson sold a very specific promise, freedom without limits. But somewhere along the way, they stopped asking a dangerous question. Who is actually stepping in next? Because the modern rider is not chasing the same life anymore. A new rider today wants something they can live with, a machine that fits into a tight schedule, crowded streets, rising costs, something approachable, something they can actually afford without turning their entire life upside down. And Harley? They kept building for a rider that already existed. The bikes got bigger, heavier, more expensive, and walking into a dealership for the first time does not feel like the beginning of a journey. It feels like stepping into a place where you already need to belong. That is where the disconnect began, not from lack of effort, but from lack of understanding. Because this was not just about missing younger riders. It was about failing to recognize that the definition of riding itself had already changed. So the pipeline dried up, no steady flow of new blood, no replacement cycle, just a loyal base getting older, with no one stepping in behind them. And here is the part most people miss. This was not the biggest mistake they made, but it was the first one. And once that foundation cracked, everything that came after became a lot harder to fix, which leads directly into the second mistake, the pricing strategy that did not just reflect the brand, but quietly locked the next generation out of it. There is nothing wrong with being premium, but there is a very clear line, and Harley-Davidson did not just cross it. They kept pushing it higher, until most riders were left staring at a price tag that no longer made sense. Because look at the modern market. A new rider can walk in today and find something lighter, faster, easier to handle at a fraction of the cost. Machines that fit real schedules, real budgets, real learning curves. And then they look at Harley, heavier bikes, higher entry points, and ownership costs that quietly stack, insurance, service, parts, adding pressure long after the purchase. At a certain point, aspiration stops inspiring. It starts pushing people away. And that is exactly where things shifted. This is not just beginners stepping back. It is city riders, weekend riders, even longtime fans who once saw Harley as the final destination, now choosing something that simply fits their reality better. So now the question becomes unavoidable. Is Harley building for growth or guarding an image that fewer people can afford to step into? Now, I want to hear from you. When you first got into riding, what actually pulled you in? And more importantly, do you feel like Harley ever tried to speak to riders like you? Or did it always feel out of reach? Drop your experience in the comments, because this gap between new riders and legacy brands is exactly where the future of motorcycling is being decided. And the moment price is no longer supported by progress, it stops being premium and starts becoming protective. Protective of something older, something rigid. And that is exactly where this goes next, into the third mistake, the deeper issue behind the pricing itself, a growing dependence on heritage that slowly turned into resistance. There is no denying what Harley-Davidson has built. Few names carry this kind of weight, the sound, the stance, the culture wrapped around it. This is not just machinery, it is identity. But that is exactly where the problem begins, because heritage is supposed to be a foundation, not a boundary. And somewhere along the way, Harley stopped using its past to push forward and started using it as a reason to hold position. You can see it in the machines. Air-cooled platforms stretch far beyond their moment. New technology introduced slowly, sometimes cautiously, while the rest of the industry moved fast with lighter builds, smarter systems, and more adaptable designs. Even bold moves felt disconnected, like experiments, not evolution. And hesitation has a cost. While Harley was preserving what it had always been, the definition of riding kept shifting underneath it. Riders wanted agility, practicality, everyday usability. Harley kept delivering familiarity. So now the uncomfortable question surfaces: are people buying what Harley builds today, or what it used to represent? Because what worked decades ago does not automatically translate to how people live and ride today. And when that gap widens, the product stops fitting the world around it. Which is why the fourth reason Harley-Davidson is doing bad is not about identity anymore. It is about reality. The kind of riding Harley kept building for versus the way people actually ride now. So next we compare the brand's vision to modern reality. The biggest shift in motorcycling did not come from engineering. It came from how people actually live with these machines. And that is where Harley-Davidson begins to fall out of alignment. Because today, for most riders, a motorcycle is not a weekend escape. It is a daily tool. It is commuting through traffic, short trips across the city, tight parking, constant stop-and-go movement. In that world, certain things matter immediately: weight, heat, maneuverability, everyday running costs. Now look at what Harley continues to center its lineup around. Big displacement, long wheelbases, heavy cruisers built for open highways, not crowded streets. And in the places where riding is growing the fastest, dense urban environments, those traits do not feel premium. They feel inconvenient. So the question changes. It is no longer, how does this bike make me feel? It becomes, can I actually live with this every single day? That is the disconnect. Harley kept building for a riding experience that used to dominate, while real-world use quietly moved in another direction. And when a product drifts out of sync with real-world use, the consequences do not appear all at once. At first, it is slower sales, hesitation, maybe a few missed buyers. But over time, that friction builds into something much heavier. Because unsold motorcycles do not just disappear. They sit, they stack, and they start creating pressure behind the scenes. Pressure that does not hit the customer first, but the system supporting the brand. And that is exactly where this leads next, into the fifth mistake, the internal strain, where inventory turns into liability and the cost of those earlier decisions finally shows up. Up to this point, the problems feel external: products, pricing, shifting riders. But inside Harley-Davidson, there is a different kind of pressure building, quieter, less visible, and far more dangerous. Because this one does not show up in marketing, it shows up in cash flow. This is where the system itself starts pushing back. Most dealerships are not sitting on fully owned inventory. Those bikes are financed, what the industry calls floor plan financing. Every motorcycle on that showroom floor is borrowed money, quietly accumulating cost over time. And that system works, as long as bikes keep moving. But when demand slows, when fewer riders walk through the door, when pricing filters people out, when products do not line up with reality, those same machines stop being assets. They become weight, interest builds, cash gets trapped, margins tighten, and now the pressure shifts. Dealers start pushing harder to move inventory. Discounts creep in. Orders get delayed. The entire pipeline begins to stutter. This is not a short-term problem, it is structural, because the system depends on constant movement to stay healthy. And when that movement weakens, the strain does not disappear, it travels. Dealers absorb it first, then the brand, and eventually the rider feels it. At first, these look like separate issues: pricing, product, demand, finance. But they are not separate, they are connected. Each one feeds the next, and together they form a loop. So now we step back and connect the full chain. So far, we have broken down the loss of new riders, the pricing barrier, and the weight of heritage holding everything back. So tell me in the comments, which of these do you think did the most damage? And while you are there, hit like and subscribe, because we are about to shift from what went wrong to what could still save Harley-Davidson. At this point, it stops looking like a list of separate problems and starts revealing something far more dangerous: a system. Because none of these failures stand alone. Each one feeds directly into the next. It begins quietly. Harley-Davidson slowly loses its incoming riders. Not overnight, but steadily. Fewer first-time buyers, fewer younger riders stepping in. The pipeline does not collapse, it fades, and that absence creates pressure. So prices rise. Margins take priority over volume. The brand leans harder into exclusivity, not to grow, but to compensate. But higher pricing does not stabilize the system. It tightens it. It pushes away the very riders Harley already failed to replace. So the company falls back on what remains, its legacy. And over time, that reliance turns into resistance. Innovation slows. Product direction circles the past. Meanwhile, the real world moves forward. Lighter bikes, urban focus, practical use. That gap spreads. And underneath it all, financial strain builds. Inventory sits longer. Costs climb. Dealers absorb the weight. Now the loop is complete. One weakness feeds another, over and over again. But here is the uncomfortable part. Systems like this do not usually correct themselves. They either collapse or get forced to change. And that raises the only question that still matters. Is Harley already too far gone, or is there still time to intervene? After everything we uncovered, the reality is uncomfortable. This is not a temporary dip, it is structural decline. And yet it still stands. Factories are running, dealers are open, the illusion of stability remains. But beneath that surface, the foundation is weakening. And still, one powerful asset refuses to disappear: recognition. Not just a logo, but an identity tied to freedom, rebellion, and American culture. That meaning still exists. Even more surprising, so does the loyalty. Not loud or unconditional, but lingering. Riders have not fully walked away, even as frustration grows. That is rare. But here is the danger. Recognition without relevance fades. Loyalty without renewal breaks. This is not a comeback. It is a final window. Because once a brand like Harley-Davidson loses the next generation of riders, it does not just lose customers, it loses continuity. And without continuity, even the strongest legacy slowly becomes a museum piece instead of a living machine. So the real question now is not what went wrong, but what would actually bring riders back into the system before that gap becomes irreversible. And that is exactly where the first solution begins. Because before anything else can be fixed, the next move has to rebuild the most important missing layer in the entire structure: the entry point itself. If Harley-Davidson is going to break this cycle, the solution does not begin at the top with flagship machines or headline innovation. It starts at the bottom. Because the real problem is not what Harley sells to seasoned riders, it is who never even gets close enough to consider one. The entry point is fractured, and without fixing that, everything above it becomes unstable. A true beginner. Harley cannot be a stripped touring bike or a symbolic starter badge. It has to be deliberately engineered. Lighter in weight, predictable in traffic, unintimidating at a stoplight, and comfortable for everyday use. And above all, genuinely affordable. Not affordable for a Harley, actually within reach. Because new riders are not comparing within the brand, they are comparing across the entire market. And right now, Harley loses that comparison immediately. This is not just about price, it is about removing hesitation. Because the moment a rider doubts the entry point, the relationship never begins. And without new riders entering, everything else slowly runs out of road. Lowering the barrier to entry can reopen the door, but opening the door does not guarantee anyone stays. Because getting riders in is only half the equation. What they experience after that determines whether the cycle continues or collapses again. And if the product behind that first purchase still reflects the same old assumptions, then nothing truly changes. It just resets the problem, which is why the next step forward goes deeper than access. The second solution, in a sense, is not a single step. It is a complete rethink of what Harley-Davidson builds and why. Fixing the entry point brings new riders through the door, but what they experience next decides everything. And this is where Harley-Davidson faces its second, far more complex problem. Because attracting attention is one thing. Meeting modern expectations is something else entirely. Today's motorcycles are no longer defined by a single purpose. Riders expect balance, lighter weight, sharper handling, real-world comfort, integrated technology, and the ability to adapt to different kinds of riding. City streets, weekend escapes, daily use. Modern riders do not commit to one identity. They expect flexibility, and that is where Harley begins to feel limited. Too heavy, too specialized, too locked into one vision of riding. So this is not about abandoning heritage. It is about redefining it. If the brand were built today, it would prioritize usability first, how the machine fits into everyday life before emotion. Right now, that order is reversed, and that worked before. It does not work anymore. The challenge is brutal. Evolve too far, and Harley risks losing its soul. Do too little, and it fades into irrelevance. Do you like this breakdown so far? Tap that like button. And if you want to support the channel on a deeper level and get early access to what is coming next, consider becoming a member. That support is what allows us to keep going deeper into stories like this without holding anything back. Adapting the product solves relevance, but it introduces a different risk. Because the moment Harley starts to change, the people who stayed loyal start to question it. And that tension between evolution and identity is where most legacy brands fail. Which is why the next solution is not about bikes at all. It is about trust. Fixing the entry point brings people in. Redefining the machines gives them a reason to stay. But none of that matters if the riders who built Harley-Davidson stop believing in it. Because beneath the strategy, there is a quieter failure, a human one. Loyal riders have not just watched the brand change, they have felt the distance grow. For decades, Harley delivered more than motorcycles. It delivered identity, something personal, something understood without explanation. That bond was built through consistency, through trust that what was promised would be real. But over time, that alignment slipped. Prices climbed, direction shifted, and the experience no longer matched the expectation. So a question began to surface. Is this still the same brand or just the same name? That is the gap Harley must close, not by forcing acceptance, but by proving authenticity, real change, honest value, clear direction. Because trust does not return through marketing, it returns through experience. And if that connection is not rebuilt, even the best machines will not be enough. These are no longer ideas, they are requirements. Because Harley-Davidson is not facing a temporary slowdown. This is structural failure. Partial fixes will not hold. Every piece must move together, entry, product, and trust, because time is gone. At this point, the outcome is simple. Adapt completely or fade slowly into irrelevance. And if this breakdown opened your eyes to what is really happening behind Harley-Davidson, do not stop here. The next video goes even deeper into the motorcycle world, where the real engineering battles, hidden failures, and industry shifts are happening right now. Click the next video on your screen and subscribe to stay locked into every new breakdown as it drops.